Notary didn't flinch. That was what I noticed first, not the document in front of her, not the fluorescent hum of the county office, but the steadiness of her hands as she pressed the seal into the paper. She looked at me the way you'd look at a man carrying something heavy across a parking lot. Careful, like she wasn't sure whether to offer help or just step out of the way. She said, "Sir, you understand what this certifies." I told her I did. She stamped it again for good measure, slid it back across the counter without another word. I drove home with that envelope on the passenger seat for 40 minutes, didn't turn on the radio, just watched the flat Georgia highway unspool ahead of me and tried to remember the last time I'd felt something settle. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the beginning. My name is Raymond Elb. I'm 63 years old and I spent most of my working life doing something nobody thinks about until it stops working: commercial refrigeration. Walk-in coolers, freezer systems, industrial compressors for grocery chains and restaurant groups across the Southeast. It's thankless work when it goes right and pure chaos when it doesn't. I've been called at 2 in the morning because the supermarket's dairy case was failing. I've driven 3 hours in a January ice storm to save a restaurant's inventory 2 days before Christmas. I don't say that to make it sound heroic. I say it because that's what the work taught me. Systems don't lie. They give you signs. The question is whether you're paying attention. My wife of 31 years, Joelle, died of a stroke 4 years ago last March. Quick, the kind of thing where you go to sleep thinking tomorrow is Tuesday and wake up to a phone call that makes Tuesday irrelevant. She was the organized one, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and made sure the gutters got cleaned before the rains came. When she was gone, I shrank, not all at once, but steadily, the way old wood softens without you noticing until you press on it. I have one son. His name is Preston, and he lives about 40 minutes from me in a suburb outside Atlanta that all looks the same pale brick, same 2-car garages, same subdivision names that reference rivers or forests that aren't there anymore. Preston is 34, works in logistics, a decent man, though we've never quite spoken the same language. His wife's name is Vonda. I should tell you about Vonda. She came into Preston's life when he was 27, and I want to be fair here, because I've spent a lot of time over the last 2 years trying to make sure I'm being fair. She was sharp, competent, the kind of person who managed every situation by managing the people in it first. She remembered what you told her, filed it away, and retrieved it later at the moment it was most useful to her. Preston admired that. He called it strength. There were moments early on when I did too. After Joelle died, Vonda stepped in, offered to help manage my bills, said she was good with finances, said I had enough to deal with. I was raw and tired and not thinking straight, so I said yes. Within 3 months, she had power of attorney for financial decisions. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I could revoke it any time. I told myself a lot of things in those first 2 years that I've since stopped believing. My father had a cabin, not a fancy thing, a 2-room structure on 12 acres in the hills above a small town in Tennessee called Pelham Fork. He'd built it himself in the late 1960s with 2 friends from the mill where he worked. Pine board walls, a stone fireplace that drew poorly in wind, a porch that overlooked a creek you could hear all night if you left the window creak. You could hear all night if you left the window cracked. He'd used it for 30 years, first for hunting, then just for the peace of it. He left it to me when he died in 2009, and for a long time I went up there twice a year with a cooler and a folding chair and did absolutely nothing productive for 4 days of the stretch. It was the only place I knew how to breathe slowly. After Joelle died, I stopped going. I don't know exactly why. Part of it was that she'd loved it too, and the absence of her in a place full of her presence was a different kind of grief than the absence of her everywhere else. I let the cabin sit, paid the property taxes, hired a neighbor to check on it twice a year, and didn't think too hard about it. Then, about 14 months ago, Vonda mentioned the cabin over dinner. It was a Sunday. Preston had grilled chicken. She was talking about consolidating things, simplifying. Her word was streamlining. She mentioned that property in that part of Tennessee had been moving, that holding on to something unused was actually costing me an opportunity. She said it so smoothly, so reasonably that I almost nodded. Something stopped me. I don't know what to call it. Not instinct exactly. More like a pause, the same pause I feel when a refrigeration unit sounds just slightly wrong. Not broken yet, but off. A half-beat of silence where there should be noise. I said I'd think about it. 3 days later, my son called and said the same thing. almost word for word. Same logic, same phrasing. Opportunity, streamlining, unused, like they'd rehearsed from the same script. That was the sound. That was the unit running wrong. I didn't say anything to either of them. I drove up to the cabin that weekend alone, first time in almost 4 years. It was November. Cold already, the creek running fast, the porch boards soft in one corner where water had gotten under. I walked through both rooms slowly, opened the drawers in the kitchen, checked the closet in the back where my father had kept his gear. In the bottom of that closet, under a folded wool blanket that smelled like cedar and old smoke, I found a metal lockbox, the kind you get at any hardware store, gray with a combination lock. And on the lid, in my father's handwriting, the same cramped block letters I'd seen on grocery lists and birthday cards my whole life, was my name. Not Raymond, not son, just Ray, the way he always wrote it when it was just for me. I sat down on the floor of that closet and stared at it for a long time. I didn't have the combination. I tried the obvious things. His birthday, the year the cabin was built, my birth year. Nothing. Then I tried the year he and my mother married, 1961. The lock turned. Inside were papers, a handwritten letter folded on top, 3 sealed envelopes beneath it, each labeled in that same block script. The letter said this: Ray, if you found this, it means something made you look. That's good. That means you haven't stopped paying attention. There's a savings account I've kept since 2004 that no one else knows about. I started it after your mother passed and kept adding to it slowly over the years. I didn't tell you because I didn't want it complicated while I was alive. The information is in the envelope marked bank. The other 2 envelopes are for the lawyer and for you personally. Only open them in that order. Don't tell Vonda. Don't tell Preston yet. Find a lawyer first. Someone of your own choosing, not theirs. Then you'll understand why. I read it 4 times. My father had been a maintenance foreman for 30 years and a quiet man his whole life. He didn't write letters. He didn't explain himself. For him to leave something like this, to have planned it, to have anticipated, it meant he had seen something I hadn't, or something I'd seen and ignored. I drove back to Atlanta that night with the lockbox in the trunk and the letter folded in my breast pocket against my chest. I didn't call Preston. I didn't say a word to Vonda. I looked up a lawyer the next morning. Not anyone local who might know them or move in the same circles. I went 2 counties over and found a solo practitioner named Aubrey Forsyth, a man in his late 60s, semi-retired with an office above a vacuum cleaner repair shop and a handshake that felt like he'd spent 30 years meaning it. I handed him the letter. He read it once without expression, set it down and said, "What's in the envelopes?" I told him I hadn't opened the one marked for the lawyer yet. He said, "Let's open it together." Inside were account statements, 9 years of them printed carefully, stapled in order by date, a savings account at a small regional bank in Tennessee. Not the same bank I used, not anything connected to my accounts, with a balance that my father had built slowly and deliberately. When I saw the number, I had to set the papers down on Aubrey's desk and look at the wall for a moment, just under $480,000. I'm not a man who grew up with money, neither was my father. He'd built that over 22 years, $30 or $50 at a time at first, then more as the years went on. He'd never touched the principal, just kept adding, kept letting it grow, never said a word. Aubrey was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Did anyone have power of attorney over your finances?" I told him yes. Vonda did. He asked how long. I said about 2 years. He set his pen down on the notepad. "This account," he said carefully, "is in your father's name, transferred to you at his death. If Vonda held your POA during that time, she may have had access to it, or tried to." He paused. "I'm going to need to make some calls." The first call was to the bank in Tennessee. I sat in Aubrey's office while he spoke to someone in their compliance department, his voice low and professional. When he hung up, he looked at me with the expression of someone who doesn't want to deliver news, but understands that delivering it cleanly is a kindness. "In 2022, he said, someone attempted to initiate a transfer from this account using power of attorney documentation. The bank's fraud review team flagged inconsistencies in the verification chain. The attempt was denied and logged. The account was placed on a secondary review list. I asked who had attempted the transfer. He looked at his notes. The documentation submitted listed a Vonda. I'm assuming your daughter-in-law as acting agent. The room was very quiet. I thought about my son. about the Sunday dinners, the grilled chicken, the way he'd mentioned the cabin without quite meeting my eyes. I thought about whether he had known. I thought about whether not knowing was better or worse. Aubrey said he needed to bring in someone else. He made a second call. 20 minutes later, a woman arrived, compact, efficient, in plain clothes with the particular stillness of someone who interviews people for a living. She introduced herself as Investigator Deb Novak, Financial Crimes Unit. She shook my hand and sat down without ceremony. She asked questions the way rain falls, steady, patient, covering the ground evenly. Who managed my bills? Who had access to my mail? Who helped me during the first year after Joelle died? Who suggested the power of attorney? Whose lawyer had drawn it up? Who had been present when I signed it? That last question stopped me. I said, Vonda's brother. Her expression didn't change. What's his name? Fielding, I said. Vonda's brother Fielding. He's a paralegal. He said it was straightforward, just a formality. Novak wrote that down. And the lawyer who drew it up? I gave her the name. She wrote that down too. I sat there looking at my own hands. Same hands that had bled on compressor coils and fixed things for other people for 40 years. And I thought about my father sitting alone in that cabin writing my name on a lockbox lid. He had known. Not everything, maybe, but enough. He had been afraid to say it while he was alive because the moment you say it, people start calling you confused. He told me that once, years ago, about a neighbor who'd gone to the police about his own children and been dismissed as senile. Once someone decides you're losing it, he'd said, everything you say gets filtered through that lens. He'd never elaborated. I hadn't asked him to. I was asking now. Too late with my father. 4 years gone, and a lockbox on a lawyer's desk. Novak looked up from her notes. Mr. Meester, Elba, she said quietly. I need you to do something that's going to be very difficult. I need you to go home and act like nothing has happened. Don't confront your daughter-in-law. Don't ask your son. Don't change anything that would signal to them that you've been here. I told her I understood. She said, if they find out we're looking, documentation disappears. And once documentation disappears, what your father built for you is very hard to protect. I drove home in the dark. Vonda had texted to ask if I wanted them to bring dinner over. I texted back and said I was fine, had leftovers, would see them Sunday. I have never in my life felt more alone in a small house. Over the next 3 weeks, I carried it. That's the only word for what it felt like, carrying it. The way you carry a bruised rib, always aware of it, adjusting every movement just slightly, careful not to breathe too deep in the wrong direction. Vonda called twice, friendly, easy, asking about the cabin. Had I thought more about it, no pressure. Fielding texted once, something about market timing on rural property in that county. I answered in short sentences, nothing unusual, nothing that suggested I'd been 2 counties over in a lawyer's office talking to a fraud investigator. At night, I wrote things down, not on my phone. In a spiral notebook I kept inside an old toolbox in the garage, the same place I keep things I don't want to lose. Dates, exact words, times. My father had built his case the same way. I'd seen it in the folder Aubrey showed me. Careful block letters, every detail recorded. I was doing it the same way, the same hands, the same instinct for documentation. It occurred to me one night that he'd been trying to teach me this my whole life, not with words, just by example. By never cutting corners, by always writing things down, by trusting systems more than promises. The call for Novak came on a Tuesday morning, early. We've identified a financial trail, she said. Transfers moved through a secondary account registered to a property management company. The company is registered in Fielding's name. I sat down. How much? We're still tracing, but it's significant, and it goes back further than the power of attorney. We think the plan predates your wife's death. That one landed differently than the rest, not the money, the timing, that they had been planning before Joelle was gone. That while I was still married, still whole, someone was already calculating what came after. I asked Novak if Preston had known. She paused. We don't have evidence that suggests he was directly involved, she said carefully, but we also can't rule out that he was aware of certain conversations. I thanked her and hung up and sat in my kitchen until the coffee went cold. My son. I kept coming back to that, not with anger exactly. Something worse. A sadness that had no clean edge to it, the kind you can't argue yourself out of because it isn't irrational. It's just true. 2 days later, Novak called again. "We're executing warrants this week," she said. "Wednesday morning. I wanted you to know." She didn't ask me to be there. She didn't need to explain why. I knew by then how these things worked. The moment the warrant goes out, everyone starts calling everyone. If I was there, it became complicated. If I was home, it was clean. Wednesday, I drove to the cabin. I hadn't planned to. I just found myself driving north without really deciding to, the way you sometimes go to a place where you can think without the walls pressing in. The cabin was cold, and the fireplace smelled like damp ash, and the creek was running loud from the rain earlier in the week. I sat on the porch with a cup of bad coffee and watched the water move. At 8:14 in the morning, my phone buzzed. "Novak, warrants executed. Both subjects in custody. Your attorney will be in touch." I set the phone face down on the porch rail. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the coffee to go cold, which is about all I can say with certainty. Not triumphant. Not relieved. Just emptied out, like after a long job, when the adrenaline drains and you're left with only tired. Preston called that afternoon. I let it ring. He called again that evening. I answered. He didn't say much at first. Just his breathing on the line uneven. Then he said, "I didn't know the whole thing, Dad." I said, "Tell me what you did know." Long pause. She said it was just that you'd have more than you'd ever use, and that she was just managing it better. She said you wouldn't notice. She said it wasn't hurting anyone. She said you would notice. I repeated that back to him quietly. He didn't respond. I said, "Your grandfather noticed. That's why he hid it." Preston was quiet for a long time after that. I didn't fill the silence. Some silences need to be sat in. We talked for another hour. Not easily, not without stopping, but we talked. That was something. Bonda's attorney called me 3 days later. Smooth voice, practiced cadence, offered to discuss restitution, partial recovery, called it a misunderstanding about the scope of the arrangement. I told him there was no scope, there was a forgery, and he could talk to Aubrey Forsyth. I hung up before he could recalibrate. Fielding had already retained his own counsel. The property management company was being dissolved. The accounts were frozen. Novak told me the full number a week later, sitting across from me in Aubrey's office again, the afternoon light coming through the single window at an angle that made everything feel slower than it was. The total they'd moved, or attempted to move, was just under $90,000 over 26 months. Plus the blocked attempt on my father's account, which, if it had succeeded, would have been the full 4080. I sat with that number for a moment. Then I thought about my father in that cabin, getting up from whatever he was doing, walking to that closet, folding those papers and putting them in that box, and setting the lock to the year he married my mother. He had known someone would come for it. He had made sure I would be the one to find it first. The trial, when it came, was businesslike the way all trials eventually are, stripped of the personal weight and translated into exhibits and testimony in procedural language that sounds nothing like actual life. Vonda sat with her attorney and kept her face composed, which I'd always admired about her and now only recognized. Fielding sat separately and looked, for the first time I could remember, like someone who had run out of angles. The prosecutor was a young woman named Dillsworth, who was calm and exhaustive in a way I found deeply reassuring. She didn't dramatize, she documented. That felt right. The bank's fraud analyst testified about signature inconsistencies on the power of attorney amendments, how the pressure patterns and letter formation differed from my father's authenticated samples. She showed them side by side on a screen. My father's signature had a slight leftward drag on the last letter of his last name, the natural artifact of a man who'd worked with his hands so long that fine motor control went slightly early. The forgery was even controlled, smooth in a way that living signatures rarely are. Too clean, the analyst said. That's usually the tell. Novak testified about the financial trail, the shell company, the timing of transfers, the emails between Vonda and Fielding discussing what my father's accounts held and whether I was checking statements regularly. One email, dated 8 months after Joel died, used the phrase, "He's not tracking anything right now." I heard that phrase and looked at my hands and thought about how grief had looked from the outside during those first 2 years, and how someone had looked at my grief and seen an opening. The sentencing came 6 weeks after the verdict. Vonda received 4 years, restitution ordered in full, asset seized pending liquidation. Fielding received 2 years and a permanent bar from any paralegal or notarial work in the state. When the judge read the sentences, the courtroom stayed quiet. No one gasped. No one cried. Just that institutional hush, like everyone had already arrived at the same place and was only waiting for the official word. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Aubrey stood beside me and didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, "Your father prepared well." I said, "He prepared for longer than I gave him credit for." Aubrey nodded. "Most of them do, in my experience. They just can't always find someone willing to carry it the rest of the way." I drove to the cabin that evening, stopped at the grocery in the nearest town, bought coffee and a box of crackers and a piece of cheese, same supplies I'd always brought. The porch boards were still soft in that one corner. The creek was low, late summer now, the water quiet and thin over the rocks. I sat out there until it got dark and the stars came out over the ridge the way they do up there, cleaner than anywhere I've lived. Inside, on the shelf above the fireplace, I put the lockbox. Not hidden this time, just there, where I could see it. I had found the third envelope that night in Aubrey's office, the one my father had marked personal. I'd read it alone, in my truck, before driving home. Ray. I know I should have said more while I was alive. I know I let things go too long hoping they'd resolve themselves. That was my mistake, not yours. You couldn't see what I saw because I didn't show you. I'm sorry for that. What I want you to know is this. You were never the problem. You trusted the people around you because you're the kind of man who does that. That's not a flaw. Don't let this make it one. Use what's left to take care of yourself. Fix the porch. Come back here more often. The Crete doesn't care what year it is. Dad, I read it a second time, slower. Then I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket, the way I'd put his first letter, and sat there in the truck with my hand over it for a minute, feeling the paper. There were things to figure out. Preston and I were in the early awkward work of rebuilding something, not back to what it was, but maybe to something more honest. He called more often now, and we talked about things we'd always gone around before. His mother's death. How much it changed me. How much he'd been afraid of losing me to grief and had let Vonda guide him when he should have been asking his own questions. We weren't fixed, but we were trying, and trying in the open is different than pretending from a comfortable distance. I took on one last commercial refrigeration job that fall. A small grocery in a town about 30 miles south, family-owned, the kind that still has a hand-painted sign above the door. Their walk-in had been limping for months. I went in, diagnosed it in an hour, ordered the part, came back and installed it in an afternoon. The owner, a man around my age, shook my hand at the end and said, "You're the third person I've had look at that. Nobody else could figure it out." I told him the system had been giving him signs the whole time. He laughed and said, "I guess I just needed someone who knew how to listen." I thought about that on the drive home. My father knew. He built the machine carefully, set it running, and trusted that someone who knew how to listen would eventually hear it. I heard it. That's the only thing I can tell you with certainty about all of it. The cabin, the lockbox, the years of quiet documentation, the courtroom, the sealed envelope with my name on it in careful block letters. He built it for someone who was still paying attention. And I want to say to anyone listening who feels like they've been told they're overreacting or imagining things or making a big deal out of nothing, the system doesn't lie. It gives you signs. The question is only whether you're still willing to listen when it does. Don't stop listening. If this story meant something to you, if you've seen something like it in your own family or just needed to hear that patience and careful attention still matter, I'd really like to know. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. We have more stories like this one, and we're going to keep telling them. If we don't want to miss the next one, please consider subscribing. We're glad you're here. I've been turning this over for a long time now, trying to understand what actually happened. Not just the legal part, the human part. Because the money was never really the center of it. The money was just the thing they went after. What they were actually counting on was something harder to name. They were counting on me not looking. That's what I keep coming back to. Vonda didn't take a risk. She made a calculation. She looked at a man who had just lost his wife, who was moving through his days at half speed, who had handed over his paperwork to someone who offered to carry it, and she decided he wouldn't check. She decided grief was a kind of permission. And for a while, she was right. I didn't check. I let things run. I told myself it was easier and called it trust. There's a difference between trust and abdication, and I learned it the hard way. My father understood something that took me much longer to see. He understood that the people most likely to take from you are often the ones closest to the door, the ones you've already let in, the ones who know your habits and your schedule and what you're paying attention to. He didn't hide that lockbox because he was paranoid. He hid it because he was paying attention. He watched how Vonda moved through situations. He watched how quickly she reoriented conversations toward money and property and streamlining. He didn't say anything to me directly because he knew what happens when an old man accuses a young woman who controls the narrative. He knew I might not believe him, so he built the case himself, quietly, over years, and he trusted that if I was still the man he'd raised, I would eventually hear the system running wrong. That trust in me, that's the part I carry now. What Vonda and Fielding did had consequences not because the universe is just, or the courts are perfect, but because they built their plan on the foundation of someone else's grief and assumed it would hold forever. It didn't. Grief passes, attention returns, and people who operate in the dark are always, on some level, betting against the moment the lights come back on. I think about Preston too. He isn't a villain in this. He's something more uncomfortable than that. A man who let someone else do his thinking for him in a season when he should have been asking questions. He loved his wife, and he trusted her competence, and he didn't look hard enough at what that competence was actually being applied to. That's not innocence. But it's not malice either. It's a kind of moral laziness that most of us are capable of when we're comfortable. The work now is making sure he knows the difference. The cabin porch still needs fixing. I'll get to it this fall. I go up there most months now the way I used to before Joelle died, before I got small. I sit by the creek with bad coffee, and I don't try to do anything useful. The lockbox sits on the shelf above the fireplace where I can see it, not as a reminder of what was taken, as a reminder that my father was still paying attention right up to the end, and that when it mattered, so was I. That's what I want to hold on to.